Everyone, thank you very much for stopping by and returning to the Old World today. A fundamental question about Warhammer the Old World. How will the games be won? Now, Games Workshop has been releasing a lot of information around how the game will be played, looking at the phases, for example, looking at psychology. We've got an almanac on magic, but what we've not seen anything around is what is the objective of the game? How will they be decided? How do we know, frankly, who has won? Now, traditionally, games of Warhammer Fantasy were fought on a battle line style arrangement. You took your 6x4 table, both armies deployed up to 12 inches from their long table edge, and then fought it out around any terrain on the field, with the objective really being to break enemy units, capture standards, and earn victory points through that method. 8th edition, however, things did change a little bit, and we saw scenarios coming into the game in a fairly playable way. Now, there were 6 scenarios which were used for standard games. There were some rules for narrative games and narrative scenarios, plus rules for creating your own scenarios. But we generally only saw, certainly from my experience, those normal standard battle scenarios being used. I think in part this is due to the explosion really of the competitive scene driving the way Warhammer was played, something which, whilst the early editions of Warhammer and 40k weren't written with the tournament game in mind, we have definitely seen in the more recent editions of the games an acknowledgement by Games Workshop that the way the game is played is driven by tournaments, and we're seeing that through the balance data sheets, etc., really buying into what is happening on tournament tables. However, I digress. Let's have a look at the scenarios from 8th edition. So the first one's Battle Line. We've talked about that already. Second one, Dawn Attack. This one had a semi-randomised deployment in that your deployment zone along the back table edge, the long table edge, was split into 3 zones. You'd roll a dice for each unit, and that determined in which of the 3 zones that unit had to deploy. Once the game started, break enemy units, capture banners, kill stuff. What else have we got? Well, we had Battle for the Pass, and deployment here was along the short table edge. The objective then was break enemy units, capture banners, etc. Starting to see a little bit of a trend. 4th one was Blood and Glory. Now this was a little bit different. You had a reduced size deployment zone, but also each army had a break value. What this meant is if enough of your standards were captured, the army would immediately break and it is game over. So you had to bring a number of banners for your units, battle standard bearer as well, to prevent that from happening. So it impacted your choices when picking an army. If it was possible, you'd end up playing Blood and Glory. So a little bit different, but also breaking units was a key part of this. Scenario number 5, Meeting Engagement. This is the first and only time we see in 8th edition the diagonal deployments that we see quite a lot in 40k now. There was some rules for bringing on reserves, but fundamentally the objective of the game was, you guessed it, break units, capture standards. Finally, we had Watchtower. This was a take and hold style objective. You had a watchtower in the middle of the table that needed to be captured. Now, whilst it did offer something different, it's again a very problematic scenario because it heavily favoured some armies over others. If you didn't have the heavy infantry you needed to fight it out in the watchtower, it was going to be a long afternoon, and armies like Chaos Warriors, for example, really used to like this mission. We played a campaign at the club I was in at the time, which was actually focused around this scenario because on paper it looks cool. And there was myself and one other guy playing Warriors of Chaos, and we basically cleared up because most other armies really start to struggle once you start fighting in a watchtower, when all other aspects of the game are secondary to that. Since then, Games Workshop has moved on in its style of really deciding how games should be played. And we've seen the regular releasing of mission packs for games like 40k, Age of Sigmar. These missions primarily focus around a primary objective of taking and holding ground, with some secondary ways of scoring points. So if there's any movement in this sort of direction, I think we'd see a move away from break enemy units being the fundamental part of the game. And I think this does feed into making the games a bit more narrative. For example, if one of the objectives represents a crossroads, a key piece of terrain, for example, it might be that your army's just trying to hold its ground as long as possible to allow something that's going on off the table to happen. You can create stories around this to make it more interesting. But if there is a move towards taking particular points on the battlefield, areas of interest, maybe trying to recover some lost treasures, whatever they may be, I think this will make the game a little bit more dynamic. You can't just sit back and wait for the game to happen. Now, that was never a good idea in Warhammer Fantasy anyway, because movement was so important. It's arguably the most important phase of the game. But some people did like to run gun lines, lots and lots of missile weapons, sat on the back of the board, castled up between a couple of units of tough infantry, and just blasting the enemy to kingdom come. A more dynamic game where you have to take ground will mean this tactic just fundamentally won't be viable. So do I think such a shift would be good for the game? Well, I think some armies would struggle. Some armies just lack aggressive mobility. Dwarves, for example, they're not particularly quick moving, albeit they were traditionally allowed to march even when the enemy got close enough to normally prevent them. However, of course, we are seeing a new style of movement rule come in to allow up to triple movement for units in marching columns. So this would perhaps move away from the traditional problems that some of these armies had. Albeit I appreciate undead historically couldn't march, or only could march if it was very limited set of circumstances were met. Another aspect worth considering within this as well is that there's a number of move or fire weapons. In games like Warhammer 40,000, heavy weapons which do well sat still can still move and shoot. They're just not as effective as they might otherwise be. But a crossbow, if your unit moves, traditionally couldn't shoot at all. And if your army is not equipped with move and fire capable weapons like bows, then you are going to struggle to bring shooting support up with an advancing line. In conclusion, I'd say that personally, I think we will see a movement away from break enemy units being the way of winning games. I think it will still be important, and I still think it'll tick through in some way towards scoring points, but I do think there's going to be more to the game than that. I think we're going to see something a little bit more dynamic, and that's probably why we're seeing the different rules around movement, to get everyone being able to shift units to where they need to be. But what do you think? How do you think games of Warhammer the Old World will be won and lost? Do let me know in the comments down below. All that remains for me to say is thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this video and perhaps others in the back catalogue, do consider dropping a subscription. It is the best way to help the channel, as long with giving your time. Once again, thank you very much. I am Return to the Old World. Have a great day.